Hi, and welcome to this episode of Consciousness and Me. My name is Josephine, and today I thought we'd talk about, or rather debunking the notion that non-dualism is equal to the fact that my own consciousness is everything that makes up the world. That I am kind of the center of the universe. And this kind of model is called solipsism. But let's start from the top. So non-dualism basically means that the world can be described by one thing. That's what the word suggests, non-dual, not two. I guess you could say oneness as well, but that has its limitations as well. So the word is non-dual, not two. And any model, any metaphysical model, and a metaphysical model is a model of how everything in the universe, all the laws that we follow, what we call the natural laws, can be explained by one model. So any model that you can describe everything starting with just one thing or one. You start with one. So for example, you break things down into smaller particles or layers or essences. For example, you can say that my thoughts are made of my consciousness. Therefore, I can describe my thought as being made of consciousness. I can reduce them down. And something that's not non-dual, that's a dual metaphysical model, is materialism or physicalism, for example, because that model suggests that there is matter out in the world, and when it becomes complex enough, consciousness arises. Or at least there's consciousness and there's matter, and they cannot be reduced to each other. So you start by explaining the world with basically having two things or two essences that cannot be described from each other. So that would not be non-dualism. But under non-dualism, there's also one specific model that's called solipsism. And that one suggests that I am sort of the only thing that exists in the universe. And everything I see and everyone I meet happens inside of me. So that means that every person I meet, I assume that they do not have their own inner lives. I assume that everything I see about them, it's all there is. So it's basically what happens when we dream at night. We are the main avatar, and we just make up the world. And if I meet a person, they don't have an experience of me. This interaction is only experienced from my perspective. And it's not uncommon that when you talk about non-dualism, people think that this is what you mean. Because in non-dualism, you usually talk about this, the essence of the world, or the one thing that everything can be described as. You use the name consciousness. And why is that normally used? Well, because consciousness is the one thing that we cannot deny. Before we are aware of anything, we are aware. So consciousness is the one thing you cannot take out of a model, basically. It's the non-dual understanding. So then you start with consciousness. So you start explaining the world with consciousness, and then you see how far you get. And if there's something that's been observed in science of how the world works that cannot be explained by consciousness, then you need to add another essence or another medium. But you don't do that unless you need it, unless it's something you cannot explain. And adding another medium also adds a different problem, because then you add a new problem into your equation, kind of, because you have to explain how consciousness interacts with something else. And the non-dual understandings haven't seen the need to use anything other than consciousness to explain everything we see in the world. And the reason it can be easy to confuse all of non-duality with solipsism, that everything happens in my mind, is Usually because we're so conditioned into a materialistic worldview, where we view consciousness as being something that exists inside of our heads. It's something that's local for me. We have this unquestioned assumption that I have one consciousness and you have another one, and everyone else has their individual. So when someone comes along and start talking about that consciousness is all there is, we put that on top of the understanding we already have, that consciousness is localized inside my head. And we think that they're pointing towards saying that everything's just dreamt out up inside my head. But this is a misunderstanding. Unless they're specifically talking about solipsism, which is quite rare and it's hard to really... It's rare that anyone argues for solipsism. But let's get back to that a little bit. Usually what's meant with non-dualism is that there is my consciousness, but then there's a universal consciousness. And it's the universal consciousness that it can be explained with everything. It might sound a bit dualistic because now I made it into being my consciousness and universal consciousness. But not really, because what is seen is basically like my consciousness is a temporary localization of the vast consciousness that exists, the essence of the universe and the world and everything, the only substance there is. But in order to understand this, we have to let go of the idea that consciousness is something that happens inside of our heads. And we know that it can manifest as thoughts and as emotions, but we don't need to limit it to that. It could manifest as other things as well. It's just that that's the way we usually think about it under the materialistic view. But if you let go of that, it could manifest as other things as well that happens outside of my mind and outside of your mind. The consciousness also manifests as the inanimate universe. So, in order to understand or to approach non-dualism, you have to make sure that your understanding of consciousness isn't locked into a materialistic view to start with, because then you're going to end up in solipsism. And that's usually not what's meant, and it's not constructive for understanding each other. Yes. So I think that's why I'm doing this video, because if we start in that misunderstanding, we can't really get any further. We can't understand each other. And even if you disagree with non-dualism, if you haven't understood it, it's not really a valid rejection either. If you talk to someone who hasn't understood it, then you're not speaking to each other in that sense. Another comment that usually comes up is, well, you can't really prove that solipsism isn't a real thing. Another thing that comes up is that you cannot prove that solipsism is not a real thing. And that's very true. There's not really, as far as we know now, a way to prove that from sitting within me that I am the only thing that exists in this universe. Hypothetically, I could just be dreaming all of this up and no one else is alive. They're just avatars in my mind. Yes, that's a possibility, but maybe it's not really interesting what's a possibility. It's more interesting what's likely. What's likely to be true. That's what's interesting to entertain. And one of the best arguments against solipsism that I ever heard is from Bernardo Kastrup. He's one of the main advocates for analytical idealism. And he says this thing, that when he was a child, I'm going to take his story straight off because I think it's so to the point. His cousin, so when he was a child, his cousin, who was a teenager, told him about being in love, of feeling all of these amazing feelings for a special person. And he, as a child, couldn't understand what she meant. He thought she'd just gone crazy. So she told him about her inner life, and he couldn't even imagine what that would be like. And then fast forward a few years until he reached adolescence and fell in love with someone. And then he experienced the same thing as she did. So this suggests that someone told him about an experience he'd never had, indicating that they maybe have an inner world of their own, or they could have just been making it up. But the fact that he later on in life experienced the same thing that she had already not foretold, but shared with him. So she basically told him about her inner life, explaining it in ways that he couldn't even imagine at the time, and then later finding out that that is a way you can experience your inner life. That indicates to him that she's not just something that he made up with his mind, because that way of feeling was beyond him at that point, but it turned out you can feel that way. So entertaining the idea that other people also have inner worlds, that if I'm not there to observe it, things still happen. That's the most... that seems more rational. That seems the most plausible way that things are. So yeah, that was my one most solid case against solipsism. But if your argument is that we cannot disprove it, then you're right. We cannot disprove it. But don't let us equate that with non-dualism. That's just one very odd model of all the non-dual models that's out there. I hope this clarified things, and if you have any questions or any thoughts around this subject, please do write in the comments below. And if you find this content interesting, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. See you next time.